People's War is what they've called it more recently, a whole of society program aimed at the destruction of this country. And what we have come to call the shape of this at the moment is World War Z. Because what is taking place now across the planet are a series of actions that have been instigated, I think it's quite reasonable to conclude, by Xi, usually through proxies, oftentimes in the immediate aftermath of meeting with them in Beijing, that have had the effect of, well, a kind of strategic arson, for want of a better term, calculated to create crises that distract the attention, divert the resources and energy, and otherwise provide greater latitude for the Chinese Communist Party because of our distractedness and the dissipation of our resources, human, financial, and weapons. The cumulative effect of all of this, as we have documented in, well, now several hundred of these programs, is to embolden Xi Jinping, the communist dictator, emperor, if you will, of China, to believe that he's winning, despite the number of difficulties at home, some of which are potentially regime threatening. He nonetheless believes that the time is approaching when he can do his master stroke, that we've been so distracted, we've been so dissipated, that he can, in fact, take Taiwan and perhaps other parts of the Western Pacific, in addition to the myriad nations that he has colonized around the world under the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. All of which is ultimately for the purpose of achieving the global domination that the Chinese Communist Party has from its inception believed was its rightful place in the world. And the only real impediment standing in the way is the United States of America. So how to accomplish this ultimate objective? Well, it has involved a fire set in Ukraine, a fire set in various parts of the Middle East. And what we're looking at now, ladies and gentlemen, I think is the prospect of a fire being set in the Pacific itself. And in that context, the role of South Korea could be of surpassing importance, most especially if it is not going to have any role at all, or perhaps yet be another flashpoint, another brush fire, another strategic arsonist incident on the Korean Peninsula, then that might make even more attractive, more promising the kind of actions that Xi is clearly preparing for Taiwan, quite possibly the Philippines, Japan, Guam, maybe Hawaii, maybe us here at home. To take stock of all of this against the backdrop of a particularly compelling individual story, we've assembled a remarkable team of panelists for this particular webinar and examination of South Korea going communist, and specifically the microcosmic symptom of that problem involving the persecution by the South Korean communist government of one of Donald Trump's ambassadors, his ambassador for global criminal justice in the first term, Morse Tan. We're going to hear from Morse himself, thanks to a video that he was kind enough to give us here in the United States in the wee hours of the day, over there in the middle of the afternoon. Over there is where he has been now for some 6 weeks, effectively held hostage by the South Korean government over alleged defamation of the communist president of what's been known as the Republic of Korea, a gentleman by the name of Lee Jae Myung. Let's go to the videotape with Ambassador Morse Tan to set the stage for this conversation now.
I've just recently been indicted, and I also had an additional travel ban stacked upon the 2 prior travel bans. So I was travel banned for the month of June. I was travel banned for the month of July. And now there's a third interlocking travel ban that is supposed to run from the middle of July to the middle of August. And my attorneys are challenging each of these travel bans. They were trying to actually hold a hearing after the end of the third travel ban on whether or not the travel ban was legitimate, which is a very obvious maneuver to try to make it so that the travel ban can't be challenged. Because if you hold the hearing after the travel ban has already expired, then it is moot at that point whether or not the travel ban is deemed to be legitimate. So, but this is all politicized lawfare. There really is no jurisdiction to begin with, because these were a comment made by a U.S. citizen, a former Trump ambassador in the United States, specifically at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and this is squarely protected by the U.S. Constitution. And this is also not legally meritorious, even if you were to take Korean law, because Korean law at that time made it so that if the statement was true or believed to be true and in the public interest, then it is protected under Korean law. In addition to that, South Korea has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 19 of which protects free speech, free expression. And therefore, this is protected speech, whether you're talking about U.S. constitutional law, whether you're talking about Korean law at the time, or whether you're talking about international standards that South Korea has ratified. Under any of these analyses, this is not a legally meritorious proceeding. As of July 7th, there is a new law that has come into force that basically has vague enunciations of things like hate speech, which is not clearly defined, is even more questionable when it would be applied. And so if anyone says anything basically at this point that the government doesn't like, then it could potentially be prosecuted. This is the extent to which free speech and free expression has been eroded, if not destroyed, here in South Korea, notwithstanding South Korean constitutional protections along those lines. But if this most recent fraudulent election is allowed to stand, then there will be a supermajority in the National Assembly, together with a fraudulently elected president who could amend the Constitution at will, pass whatever oppressive or repressive laws at will. And so the situation in South Korea is very serious, even more so considering that the country is being communized and you have this emerging dictatorship in South Korea, where it is resembling more and more North Korea day by day, heavily infiltrated by the Chinese Communist Party as well, heavily infiltrated by North Korean agents and spies and operatives. And this is a regime that has dismantled the Defense Intelligence Command, dismantled its drone command, sacked all the flag officers, all the generals, all the admirals, and even went down to all the colonels and eliminated them all in one fell swoop. This has never happened before. And also attacking religious liberty, free exercise of religion. There have been unprecedented raids on Christian churches and pastors thrown in jail, pastors being prosecuted, Christian schools being shut down. This is the reality of what is happening because under communist doctrine, they do the long march through the institution for decades, but now they see the finish line in sight. And so they've slammed on the accelerator and they are going full speed ahead to try to fully communize South Korea. And so even just the changes that have occurred over the past year have rendered our key ally of South Korea unrecognizable from the one that was frankly rescued by the United States in the Korean War from coming under communist tyranny then, and was also helped immensely by the United States in building upon the ruin and rubble of the Korean War and taking on American systems and all sorts of other American cultural things, so that it has become the 10th biggest economy in the world. And yet that is all in grave danger right now because of this illegitimate government that has seized power through fraud. And so when President Trump said, what is going on in South Korea? It looks like a revolution or purge. It was actually correct on both counts. It is a revolution and a purge, and both are happening. And this is something that our government should be deeply concerned about and should be contemplating how to take strong measures to counter. Because North Korea is making war preparations. The CCP, as we know, is menacing Taiwan. And this is a fake president who is saying, oh, what would a cross-strait invasion of Taiwan have to do with us? And when he was asked whether he would defend Taiwan, he said, oh, I'll answer that after aliens invaded Earth. And so this is someone who cannot be relied upon to not only defend Taiwan, but to even defend South Korea, because he is opening the windows and doors for a North Korean invasion of South Korea, and has bribed North Korea, and also is treasonously opening up South Korea to potentially being taken over by North Korea. The people are being run over right now. And so, look, the people of South Korea love America, love the American people. They overwhelmingly consider the U.S. to be the most important ally. And so they are being, it's like a giant anaconda strangling a person. And that is what is happening to the Korean people. They are being encircled and strangled as all the levers of power and authority, almost all of them, are now in the hands of these radicals who are running roughshod over the people. The rule of law has almost completely broken down here in terms of the laws that are passed that are oppressive and repressive and self-protective of the current regime and trying to consolidate the power of the current regime. Look, when you have a law that passes that says anytime the executive branch doesn't like a ruling of the Supreme Court or any judge, they can sic the police on them and overrule whatever they decide, then you don't have the rule of law. And there's a whole array of nonsense so-called laws that have been passed here in South Korea that are being used to strangle the people. It is not by the people, of the people, or for the people. It is by and for the illegitimate dictator of South Korea. He was not elected by the people, and the president who was duly elected is in prison with a life sentence and several additional sentences on top of that. That is also true of the top leadership of the rightful president. So imagine if President Trump was thrown in jail, Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, the rest of the cabinet, as well as top military leaders, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Kane. Imagine all of them being thrown in prison and Congress being taken over by a veto-proof supermajority. But you also have the White House being taken over by a communist. And you also have the two nearest countries to you that are communists trying to take over. And then you also have all sorts of radical elements inside the country seeking to do that. Imagine if that were to happen in the United States, and then you'll start to get an idea of what the picture is here in South Korea.
Yeah.
Unmute, please.
Imagine indeed what this is going to be like if this continues to metastasize in South Korea. We're going to hear next from a man who has frequently contributed to these programs, a very distinguished and highly appreciated member of our Committee on the Present Danger of China. His name is Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps, retired. Grant has the distinction of having also served as a Foreign Service officer in our embassy in Tokyo. He has been a businessman in East Asia for many years, but has also been an author, in addition to innumerable columns and essays of a best-selling book entitled When China Attacks, A Warning to America. We've asked the Colonel to talk a little bit further about what has been going on inside South Korea. We're going to get several perspectives on that in the course of the program, but we're anxious to have his sort of strategic vision in particular applied to the topic. Let's go to a video that he gave us earlier today.
This issue with Morse Tan and what his arrest and indictment and being held in South Korea is a microcosm, if you will, of a larger strategic problem that it seems to be occurring with the Republic of Korea, as Grant has outlined, with the Lee administration and their clearly left-leaning tendencies and leaning towards the People's Republic of China. In addition to the items that Grant mentioned domestically, there's also, he ran through the National Assembly, what they call this Local Autonomy Act, where they're going to actually set up and establish these kind of very similar to what happens in China and North Korea, local government agents that will administer and watch and report on what's happening in villages and towns across all of South Korea. So it's a very much a top-down centralized control approach that should cause people that believe in freedom and democracy to have some concern. Strategically, you know, the United States has had this relationship with South Korea since the Korean War, where we went and walked shoulder to shoulder, kapshi da, with our South Korean counterparts to defend them against communist China and the North Korean regime that's been there in power since the end of the truce in '53. And so we have about 28,500 U.S. military members that are stationed on the Korean Peninsula. And during my time in uniform, and we would exercise and do operations in South Korea several times a year. There's a lot of tactical and operational integration between the U.S. military and the ROC military. And for many of those years, it was just a bilateral exchange and working relationship. And what we started to see maybe about a decade and a half ago was this try to expand this idea that U.S. alliance with Japan, U.S. alliance with South Korea are actually, it's really the three nations together that have mutual interest in, you know, defending themselves against the People's Republic of China, North Korea, and the Russians out in the Far East. And so there was a lot of work and a lot of effort trying to get sharing agreements for intelligence and things of that nature. It's always ebbed and flowed depending on who's been in office in Washington and in Seoul. but we have a new commander there. Well, he's not new now. He's been there for a year. General Brunson, Xavier Brunson, and he actually talked about this thing that he's described as a kill web, which is this idea that what goes on the Korean Peninsula isn't just only resides in the Korean Peninsula, but has to do with other relationships, not only with the trilateral relationship with Japan, but also with an emerging trilateral relationship between South Korea, Japan, and Manila, and how that relates to what China's trying to do to take Taiwan. And so the General Brunson's been talking about that, and the Lee administration, when it came in, pushed back on it and is still kind of resistant to it. So much so that, for instance, we've seen actual operations be impacted. For instance, in February, there was supposed to be a trilateral U.S., Japan, South Korea air operation in the East China Sea and the Yellow Sea, the 16th and the 18th of February. And the Chinese reacted when we flew some B-52 bombers and some of our fighters into that area, and they intercepted our aircraft, which is understandable. That's what the Chinese do. But what was unprecedented in the history of our relationship with South Korea is that the South Korean government called in the U.S. side and the U.S. commander and complained about what the U.S. was doing, not about the Chinese intercept of our aircraft. And so we're facing a different relationship with the Republic of Korea than we've ever had before. And it's strategically important because this notion of this kill web, this interrelationship between allies in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia in terms of dealing with the People's Republic of China and dealing with North Korea and their predations, is a serious issue. And if we cannot rely on South Korea, that puts our whole alliance structure in a very dangerous position. Other things that have gone on in terms of these operations or activities, we have statements from the Lee administration saying that they support China's view of the one China policy versus Taiwan. China and South Korea have come out and both supported the globalization of their currencies, the yuan and the won. So the Lee administration seems to be moving in different spots and areas to show that they're more aligned with China than they are with the United States. And that's greatly concerning for our alliance structure, especially since today was just signed in the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., a $150 billion shipbuilding agreement under the auspices of this Korea-U.S. Shipbuilding Partnership Initiative. So this initiative was signed, Secretary of Commerce Lutnick was there with representatives from the South Korean government. We've already established the South Korean shipping company and shipbuilding firm Hanwha is going to revitalize our Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. We have contracts for 2 missile test platforms that will be used out at Barking Sands from platforms that were built in the mid-60s and early 70s. Those are going to be renovated by Hanwha at Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. They also signed a $10 billion contract for the NGLS, Next Generation Logistics Ship. So we're going into full integration with the South Korean shipbuilding firm. Was just announced here on Chinese press this last 24 hours that China accounts for about 73% of all global shipbuilding. South Korea accounts for about 20%. So there's about a 50% of the global market share difference there that China has over South Korea. And so we're getting involved with South Korea. We're putting our eggs in the South Korea shipbuilding basket at the same time that we're watching this current Lee administration in Seoul make these kind of disturbing actions towards the United States. And so I have great concern about operational security and things of these nature. Now, maybe a lot of it will be fine, but we need to be very, very circumspect about what's happening, and we need to place operational security at as a high priority, especially since the South Korean under Lee has put out a plan to say that they would like to have nuclear submarines, and they want the United States of America to assist them in building nuclear submarines. The administration hasn't committed to doing that yet, but seems like the ball is moving down that track to do that. And we should be very, very careful about what technologies we're sharing in terms of the South Korean shipbuilding industry right now at this time with the Lee administration. So my concern is we have demonstrations from this administration that they're taking anti-American stances, even while on some things they try to get our money and have us invest and take, investment from American taxpayers so that their shipbuilding corporations can come to America and, as they said, embed rock shipbuilding into America's global supply chain system. That's the stated goal of this agreement that was signed today. So great concern that we're not being cautious enough at this point. And at least as Grant has said, we should be putting conditions on the relationship to make sure that Lee and his team are not just having freewheeling capability to silence critics like Mr. Tan here. This is very dangerous, and so it just gets to our alliance defense system in the Western Pacific, and we need to be attentive to it. Frank, if the Lee administration were to make a move to remove American military forces from the Korean Peninsula, it would likely be a green light to Kim Jong-un, at a minimum, to take action against South Korea, because there's no way right now that the ROK military on its own could defend from a North Korean invasion scenario across the DMZ. That's just on the peninsula. But the larger issue is if the United States military is off the Korean Peninsula, then we no longer have what General Brunson called a few months ago the dagger in the heart of the PRC. He characterized America-South Korea military alliance and presence on the peninsula as a dagger to the heart of the People's Republic of China and the PLA. Not that we would attack them, but it was a dagger there as a deterrent. And so if that deterrent dagger is removed, the Chinese then are unleashed to be able to take Taiwan with less resistance. So it's very dangerous if he was to make moves in that area. And we would be hard-pressed, I think, in some sense, because America has always been very respectful of our allies. You can recall what we did in the early 90s in the Republic of the Philippines when the Philippine Senate said we voted by one vote only to remove the U.S. military. It took us another 20 years to get back to have access to bases in the Philippines. And we lost a significant amount of time and buildup in the Philippines that they're facing right now, being bullied about and beat about by the Chinese Coast Guard and Chinese Navy in the South China Sea. The same kind of thing could happen in South Korea, and we may not be able to recover from that. We're in a contest right now, and we've been in one with the Chinese Communist Party. They say they're at war with us. We're in a contest. Not everybody in America has recognized that for years, but we are in it, and we have been making significant progress in alliance building. You can take the Quad with India, Australia, Japan, and the U.S. You can take these initiatives like the Kill Web that General Brunson's mentioned between Japan, Korea, and the U.S. We've been expanding, operations and activities after decades of neglect in the Western Pacific. And so that's a good sign that we're serious and understand the threat. But if South Korea were suddenly to be compromised and become in the orbit of the Chinese Communist Party, that changes the entire strategic dynamic in Asia. And as I said earlier, it puts Taiwan's survivability at great risk. When Prime Minister Takaichi of Japan said that if China were to invade Taiwan, that would have severe consequences for Japan's national security, the Lee administration didn't say likewise. They were very silent, and even some, as I recall, had some condemnation out of South Korea for what the Prime Minister of Japan said. So we're facing not just a loss of an ally, but we could be facing somebody that could be flipped and become adversarial. So this is a very inopportune time for this to happen, and part of it comes from managing bilateral relations. And as people in the Committee on Present Danger spoke up months ago when the election was being held last year, there was calls to say, hey, we need to speak out and help and assist those who are trying to stand up for our alliance in South Korea, and that didn't happen. And so now we're kind of, in a sense, reaping what we didn't sow. What we're seeing is not just happenstance and just the turn of the calendar and things just evolve. This is a concerted effort by the Chinese Communist Party to disrupt the American alliance infrastructure. We just had our president go on television, national television, a week ago and tell America and the world that China was involved with influencing and disrupting our elections in America. You think they're not doing the same thing in South Korea? You think they're not trying to do the same thing in Japan, the same thing in Taiwan, the same thing in the Philippines, the same thing in Australia? That's what they're doing. And so we're seeing the manifestations of that by the things that Grant and Mr. Tan have described. And so it's a concerted effort, and we just can't sit back passively and say, well, we don't want to upset China because we want to have a summit or we want to work on a trade negotiations or something like that. It doesn't make sense because they're coming for us and we know it. And so we have to take some active measures. Now, we're not saying anything about anything unconstitutional for South Korea, but at least we should be speaking up for these actions that go against our alliance interests, our mutual interest in making sure that North Korea doesn't launch ballistic missiles, nuclear ballistic missiles, and China is invading Taiwan or invading Japan or something else. So we have mutual interests and we need to press those things and we need to hold our partners to account for that. And if we can do it with NATO in about percentage of GDP spending, then we sure as hell can do it in South Korea to say, hey, oh, by the way, we want you guys to make sure you dial it back on this anti-Americanism and trying to go against our long-standing mill-to-mill relationship and tactical actions. It's very dangerous.
Thank you, Colonel Newsom. Very important insights into what is taking place inside this allied nation that is, I like to say, in the words of Barack Obama, fundamentally transforming it. To talk next about what the implications are of all of this for our alliance posture, especially in a moment when, as I indicated earlier, the Chinese Communist Party is clearly, aggressively intensifying the threat that it poses to Taiwan and other friends and allies of the United States in the Western Pacific. We wanted to turn to Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired, a man who has been at the very apex of the effort to understand the true character of the threat we face from the Chinese Communist Party, military as well as political warfare, economic warfare, and other aspects of the unrestricted warfare that has been our lot since this all began back in the 1990s. Captain Fennell is also an author, numerous essays and columns, many of them at American Greatness, as well as a very important book he co-authored with Dr. Bradley Fair, entitled Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. This naval intelligence officer, who in his last duty station was the man who was chief of intelligence and information operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was kind enough to give us a video message as well. Let's go to that now.
So South Korea has been a very good ally for an awfully long time, almost 80 years now, and we've considered it and as one of our staunch allies and friends in Northeast Asia. But nothing lasts forever, and the relationship is in great danger now. The events in South Korea, say really over about the last decade, I think, show you a systematic effort by hardcore South Korean leftists to take over the country, to turn it into a one-party state where they permanently rule. These guys are basically pro-North Korea, pro-China, and that's their objective, and they've been going about it carefully. And they have managed to accumulate, really starting from about 2020, control of just about every lever of power in South Korea. They've got the media, they've thoroughly cowed that, the police, the judiciary, the intelligence service, very importantly, of course, the National Election Commission, which means they basically have control over elections and how they are run. And since at least the 2020 election in South Korea, there has been compelling, overwhelming evidence of systematic electoral fraud that has given the leftists majority control in the parliament, in the National Assembly, in fact, overwhelming control, and now they have the presidency as well. So they've pretty got just about everything that matters when you're trying to control a country. They've got the main labor union is very close to North Korea. Their leaders have been convicted of really taking orders from North Korean spies. The military is being brought to heel by the leftists, and even South Korean big business. Companies like Samsung, for example, have been under huge pressure by leftist administrations to do what they say. And it has been, very clear. It's not hard to see what's happened. There was actually a respite starting in 2022 for just a few years when a fellow named Yoon Suk-yeol was elected president. He was a conservative. He was elected in very, very odd circumstances. And it looked as if basically the people rigging the election weren't quite meticulous enough to get it just right. But as soon as he took power, the leftist-dominated National Assembly, leftist-controlled National Assembly, started to impeach him. And they impeached him and his officials about 30 times. And he was just so desperate that he declared martial law in 2024. And then it was very short-lived. It wasn't all that well done, but it was quite legal. He did it because he was unable to govern. And the National Assembly had in fact done things like just zero out his budgets. They made life so miserable that South Korea could not be run, could not be governed. And that was the objective, was to make it ungovernable. So he declared martial law. He gave it up as soon as constitutional procedures were followed, which was in about 12 hours. And he was then subsequently arrested, tried, and convicted very quickly. That set the stage for the return of the leftist into the presidency. And now the president is a fellow named Lee Jae Myung, who is on record of having said that he sees the American forces as occupiers. In his administration, the prime minister, until very recently, he was convicted sentenced to prison as a young man for having engaged in pro-North Korea anti-American activities. And this was along with his elder brother, who has immense influence in the administration, and who has described Trump's America as the apex of Yankee imperialism, the head of the ruling Democratic Party of Korea. He too served time in prison as a young man for having once again engaged in pro-North Korea anti-American activities. What were the anti-American activities? Well, one was an attack on the U.S. ambassador's residence. The other was a violent occupation of a USIA office in Seoul. And these are the kind of people you have in the South Korean administration. You just have to look at what they say, look at what they intend to, and what their intentions are. And you'll notice that none of them have ever said, look, we were young, we were stupid. No, but very much this is something we have no regrets for, and we're going to keep at it until we get our objectives, and they see that objective as in sight. Now, since taking over in 2025, Lee Jae Myung, his administration has picked fights with the United States over how the DMZ, demilitarized zone, is run. Despite long-standing, very effective procedures, they've had prosecutors go into very sensitive areas at Osan Air Base and take sensitive information and reveal it, basically. They have actually had South Korea, the unification minister, who released sensitive information, secret information provided by the Americans about North Korea's nuclear activities. And they are also pushing to get something that's called operational control in wartime over forces on the peninsula, despite an agreement with the Americans that this would not happen until the South Koreans were ready for it, until circumstances were acceptable. But they're moving ahead with this. So there's this, it's almost aggressive move against the Americans to roil the relationship. Lee Jae Myung, back to him, he has equated Israel with the Holocaust based on the events in Gaza. He arranged to send $500,000 to Iran for humanitarian aid. He has said that if China goes after Taiwan, well, that's China's business. South Korea has no interest in that. Well, you start to ask, what kind of an ally is this guy? And when he was governor of Gyeonggi province not long ago, his chief assistant was convicted for sending at least $6 million to North Korea. Lee has been charged with it as well, and that case is still on hold, but one can put two and two together on that. Now, the thing that really gives us some advantage here, if there is one, or puts a brake really on what the leftists are trying to do, is that most South Koreans don't want this. They don't want to lose their democracy, lose their consensual government, and that is, as I said, a break. They even support the U.S. alliance with South Korea by a large measure, if polls are to be believed, and they don't want that change. But we've seen before how really a gang of aggressive, ruthless leftists can take a country even where most people don't want to go. Remember Venezuela, and that is a cautionary case. When Chavez came over in the late 1990s, he was said just to be a populist. He wasn't a problem in any way. Venezuela was the oldest democracy in the Western Hemisphere. We had excellent relations with the military. It was a capitalist system, and they would take care of things. The military would, if there were any problems. But gradually, Chavez got every lever of power, like the ones I described earlier, and you saw what happened to Venezuela. Then his successor, Maduro, took over and has turned Venezuela into what it is. So these things happen gradually so that you almost don't notice it unless you're watching closely. And it's even easier to pretend nothing's happening, even if you do kind of sense something wrong. Another example, Turkey under Erdogan. Once he took over in around 2013, 2014, he gradually, once again, got every lever of power, even brought the military under his control. And now Turkey is no longer the ally, the long-standing ally that we thought it was. So there's no reason this could not happen in South Korea. And this, of course, is to China's benefit, to North Korea's benefit, and it upsets the entire American security architecture in the region. But it's happening. And one thing that we notice, particularly in recent years, is that no U.S. administration has been willing to address the problems and the potential warning signs in South Korea. None of them, even though they've known about it. And the idea seems to be, well, let's pretend there's nothing going on. It's a great relationship forged in blood, blah, blah, blah. And you see a country slipping away before our very eyes. And really all you have to do is to speak up. Because most South Koreans, as I said, don't want what the leftists have to offer, but they are under such pressure to the point where if they were to go, if conservative Koreans were to go in front of the American embassy and protest Donald Trump, nothing would happen. If they went in front of the Chinese embassy and tore up a picture of Xi Jinping, they would get arrested. That's where things are. But we won't even put in a good word for say the importance of honest, consensual government and even the alliance. And this is the oxygen that the conservatives need and that the leftists hope we don't provide. So you can't keep ignoring this, thinking that, well, we're going to get a lot of business and investment from South Korea. No, all that shows is, what that shows is the potential in South Korea to be a very good ally. But if you're just going to stay mute because you're going to get some money, well, you're ultimately going to see South Korea shift away. So it's really up to this administration, our administration, to decide whether they even want to speak up. They are sending a good ambassador, Michelle Steele, there, but she had better go with marching orders to actually stand up for our interests and also for the wishes of most of the South Korean people. We will see if that happens. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Captain, and thank you especially for putting a spotlight on something that I think urgently requires, adult supervision is what comes to mind, and that is the notion that we are going to become very deeply entangled with the shipbuilding sector of South Korea, which is in principle potentially a very important partner, but not under its present management. And I don't mean the company so much as the country. This could be indeed a formula for, a dependency that is as daft as relying on the Chinese for components of our weapon systems, and possibly essentially the same thing by virtue of technology transfer to the South Koreans and then on to their friends in perhaps North Korea, certainly in China, one would expect. We're going to take one more video, and I apologize to our audience as well as our other panelists, particularly the two that are willing to be here live. These are a little bit longer presentations than we usually try to restrict ourselves to, but the substance is so important, and the timeliness of this analysis for understanding a rapidly metastasizing problem is such that we believe that there's in everybody's interest to have a more fulsome conversation than we would otherwise do. So we're going to go to another of our distinguished veterans, a woman who has served in the uniform of the United States Air Force, rose through its ranks to that of colonel. She is a PhD on top of that, a woman who has distinguished herself since leaving the uniformed services in a variety of capacities, notably these days as a senior fellow of an organization known as the Institute for Korean American Studies, better known as ICAS. She is the author of The Collapse of North Korea, Challenges, Planning, and Geopolitics of Unification. Tara Oh is her name, and we'll go to a videotape that Colonel Oh was kind enough to give us earlier today as well.
There's a far left government in South Korea that looks toward communist China and North Korea. And they stand against the Republic of Korea, the United States, and Japan. So that is the bottom line. And so currently what you see are attacks on freedom, on free enterprise, including American companies, and centralization of power, among others. So I'd like to touch upon those three topics. So first of all, freedom. I know that Ambassador Morse Tan, South Korean government has issued an exit ban for a speech that he gave in the United States. And we have freedom of speech in this country. Of course, there's freedom of speech in South Korea as well. It's in the Constitution. But that is one issue. But it's not just against Ambassador Tan. They recently passed they amended an Information and Communications Network Act, or what it actually is free speech suppression law. And this became effective on July 7th, 2026, and that's what they're charging him with, retroactively. So this law, what it does is it punishes people and companies for posting or distributing what the Democratic Party of Korea, DPK, deems hate speech, or what they call false information. And the punishment is with up to 1 billion won, which is about $685,000. It's a huge amount of money, and up to 10 years imprisonment. So this applies to the media, to YouTubers, bloggers, just everyday citizens in general, and also social media platforms. So that's like X, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. So these American companies, their platform, these platforms are also subject to punishment if they don't remove or block some of these information. So that's something that, again, just started as of July 7th this year, earlier this month. There's another law that they passed. This was several years ago. It's called 518 History Distortion Punishment Law. And this is about an incident in Gwangju in 1980, in May 1980. Now, if people say anything other than the narrative, so if they say it was a rebellion, or if they say that North Korea was involved, then they can go to prison for 5 years for saying something like that. They call it history distortion law, but it's not really. The distorting was done by them, not by the people. They have to say it was democracy movement, but originally it was deemed rebellion by the court. So with that law, they're investigating and prosecuting citizens as we speak, and they include prosecuting and investigating youth as well as pastors. The DPK, the Democratic Party, is trying to add this very controversial event into the Constitution. So that is what they're trying to do. I like to, again, move on to the freedom of religion aspect that I mentioned earlier. In addition to those pastors who said something about this May 1980 incident in South Korea, there are other suppression of free speech, especially pertaining to the pastors who have been speaking out about the far left's takeover of the government and orienting Korea towards the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. So for that, they jailed Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon and Pastor Son Hyun-bo. They're released now, but they were jailed earlier prior to any trial or any kind of charges. Also, the churches are threatened with confiscation of their assets. So that's something else that they're doing to suppress the church. There is another aspect, which is they're doing away with separation of power. More and more of that is going on. And one way they're doing that is packing the Supreme Court. So currently, there are 14 Supreme Court justices. But the National Assembly passed a law that increases the number of justices from 14, which is already too many, to 26. And so that's a huge jump. And 22 of them will be appointed by Lee Jae Myung, the current president. So that's another concern, because this is blurring of separation of power. Let me talk about the attack on American companies. There's a company called Coupang. It's an American e-commerce company, and you can think of Amazon. It acts like an Amazon in Korea. It's very popular there, and if you order something online, it's delivered to your door the next morning. So this is very, widely used company. And so a couple things. One, the radical left labor union decided that the delivery personnel should not deliver during dawn hours. So they deliver first thing in the morning, but they want to prevent that. They're targeting Coupang. Next thing that they did, actually they meaning the DPK, Democratic Party of Korea, and the Lee Jae Myung government, they started investigating Coupang. And they summoned them to National Assembly hearing where they have to go through this hostile grilling by the DPK lawmakers. And they have been harassed for really, really long time, and they were singled out. So again, this is an American company, and it turns out that this occurred during the time when China's Temu and AliExpress, which is Alibaba, entered the Korean market. So this favors the Chinese companies, but against American companies. Similarly, Starbucks in Korea, all of a sudden was attacked by various DPK lawmakers and the far left camp. For Starbucks, they had a promotion called Tank Day, And this is the annual promotion, and this has been going on with no issues in the past. But all of a sudden, they made this into an issue. They accused Starbucks of celebrating the tank attacking and crushing people, and they linked it to that Gwangju May 1980 incident again. But there were no tanks there. Only place there were tanks that was running over people and attacking people, that happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989 in China. So they're getting the history all mixed up, but it doesn't matter. The historical facts don't matter to them. They actually made the CEO resign and call for a boycott. And this went on for a while. And this also could be related to several issues, but one is that the Starbucks in Korea is owned and operated by Shinsegae Group. And its chairman, Jung Yong-jin, had posted on Instagram a few years ago a motto that was very widely used during the Korean War, which was destroy communism. Now, I want to talk about timing again. The timing of this attack is interesting because this occurred as a Chinese tea shop called Chaji recently entered the Korean market. So again, they seem to be attacking U.S. companies as Chinese companies are entering Korean market. So talking about China, there have been numerous pro-communist China policies. And let me talk about some of these policies, laws, and rules. So one is they made basically created visa-free entry for hundreds of thousands of Chinese to be able to go to Korea, especially around the time of elections, interestingly. The election was held June 3rd this year, and then with early voting in late May. So we have that. There's Xi Jinping Library at Seoul National University, which is a top university in South Korea. So right in the middle of the library, there's Xi Jinping Library. And numerous Confucius Institutes in South Korea. And it seems like many people still don't know in Korea that it's a subversive organization. There are a lot of Chinese spies who have been using drones to take pictures of American military base in South Korea, like Osan, and also Korean facilities, Korean military bases and intelligence facilities. But they were caught, but they have to be released because there are no laws in South Korea that can prosecute spies, except for very specific law, national security law, which is only for North Korean spies. So that is going on. And surprisingly, Chinese citizens can vote in South Korea in local elections. And that's if they have 3-year residency and green card. So even if they live in China, as long as they have that requirement, then they can vote in Korean elections, electing mayors and education superintendents and local legislators, like at the city level, mayors and things like that. So, which is not good. And that local election was nationwide, and that was held on June 3rd again. And there has been actually protest since June 5th that's going on right now. It's been going on 24/7 continuously in South Korea. People were protesting against the rigged election. Something else I'd like to talk about is dismantling of the institutions and traditions. And this sort of is reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution in China, although revolution happens very quickly. So it's not happening as quickly, but it is happening. So Defense Counterintelligence Command, which is a very old institution. It's been around even before the creation of the Republic of Korea, which occurred in 1948. So this existed prior to that. And it catches North Korean spies, and they got rid of that. They dismantled it recently. They also, there's another intelligence organization, NIS, National Intelligence Service, which is like CIA. And again, they didn't dismantle it, but essentially they took away its core function, which is its authority to catch North Korean spies. They are also trying to dismantle the ROK, Republic of Korea Military Academy, Again, this has been around since since before the creation of the Republic of Korea, and it's modeled after the West Point. It's for the ROK Army, and General Van Fleet, who fought during the Korean War, he played a major role in its creation. So they want to get rid of this. They want to get rid of this military academy. The defense minister, An Gyu-baek, he plans to shut it down, but not only shut it down, but also to tear the building down. Just tear the whole thing down and build high-rise condos on that land, and then create a new academy with all the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, all together combined. And that is the plan. And this is really, really opposed by, but I mean, there's no good reason that's given for this move, other than they want to indoctrinate the cadets with leftist ideology, and they want full control of it and erase the history and the proud tradition of that. So, there are more things that are going on, but let me just stop there.
Thank you so much, Colonel O. This was brilliantly clarifying about how the communization of South Korea is advancing incrementally, but seemingly at an accelerating rate. We're going to turn next to our two very patient in-person participants. The first is Dr. Suzanne Schulte. She is the president of the Defense Forum Foundation, marvelous organization that brings information to Capitol Hill in a very, very effective way. She is also, among other things, a preeminent figure in the entire ecosystem of groups, non-for-profit groups, most of them American, some Korean, that have been working tirelessly under mostly her leadership to try to help free the long-suffering people of North Korea, who have been enslaved by communism for decades, and we fear are going to be experiencing a growth in the numbers of people facing such enslavement if the trajectory we've been discussing continues. Suzanne Schulte will draw on, among other things, her experience as the chairman of the North Korea Freedom Coalition, the vice chairman of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, the honorary chairman of the Free North Korea Radio. She also has the distinction of being the recipient of the Seoul Peace Prize. We're always delighted to have her with us. Dr. Schulte, thank you so much for being with us and being patient, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frank. It's an honor to be on here, and it is a disturbing topic, but I'm going to speak at it specifically from the work that pertains to the promotion of North Korea's human rights. And what does that mean during the Lee government? As someone who's been active on promoting North Korean human rights issues for 30 years. So basically, to underscore what Tara talked a lot about, what was going on in South Korea, I'm going to focus on how that's impacting the situation in North Korea. And I can say emphatically that we are facing the most difficult period in the history of the North Korea human rights movement. And that is because of the current president of South Korea. And I want to cite a couple of things that have happened just in the last several months. First of all, this is something that both the classic liberal left and the conservative right are both understanding and seeing, is the deterioration of civil liberties and rights in the Republic of Korea. In March 2026, Justice Michael Kirby, who was the head of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Crimes Against Humanity in North Korea, gave a speech at the Korean Assembly where he said that the South Korean government is closing its eyes and turning its backs on addressing the human rights situation in North Korea. He just gave this powerful speech about his real deep concerns that they were not taking any action towards the findings of what the commission had concluded, which was that gross violations of human rights are happening in North Korea that have no parallel. And this was a wonderful speech, but it came from somebody who is a classic liberal. And then more recently, in April, our House Foreign Affairs Committee, bipartisan Republicans and Democrats under the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, held a hearing to look at the same concerns about the erosion of civil and political rights in South Korea. And I want to just quote what Congressman Chris Smith had to say, which was, South Korea is abandoning human rights and is beginning to look more like North Korea and Communist China, as Frank, you pointed out earlier. Not only is Lee failing to advocate for the victims of North Korean dictatorship, but it's abusing his own citizens' freedoms. I want to point out that we now have an administration in South Korea for the first time in history that's completely abandoning its constitutional obligations in multiple ways to ensure that the Kim dictatorship continues. There's no one on earth that's more responsible for upholding the rights of the North Korean people than the president of South Korea, because the people born north of the DMZ are citizens under the South Korean Constitution. There's two things that have happened that had never happened before. Number one is that the South Korean government has stopped the broadcast of radio programming into North Korea. That continued even during the sunshine years of the appeasement policies of the Roe and DJ Kim administration. Also continued under the Moon administration. That they have completely abandoned the radio programs that are broadcast in North Korea. And then a second thing that's happened is they also have stopped funding any support for the North Korean defector NGOs. Again, this is significant because even during the sunshine years and even during the Moon administration, they still funded the Committee for the Democratization of North Korea, which was the organization founded by Hwang Jong-yap that's kind of seen as the umbrella group for all the defector organizations. So they've ended all their support for these important things. And why have they done that? Well, because we were winning the information campaign. And Frank, you know well that we've been very involved with Free North Korea Radio. We broadcast every morning, but we've also been getting material and humanitarian aid into North Korea very successfully for many years. Hundreds of thousands of leaflets, 4 tons of rice, radios, Bibles, all kinds of information. We were basically winning that battle. But this current government in South Korea has worked to shut down all the work that we were doing. They can't stop our radio broadcast because thankfully it's done outside of the Korean Peninsula, but they have succeeded in doing something that's very chilling. And that is they are restricting our ability to get information into North Korea. We were successfully delivering, like using rice bottles, we were getting radios in, we were getting all kinds of information in. And that is why you saw the enactment of this anti-lethaling law that they're vigorously enforcing, even though it's unconstitutional. And just to give you an example of how chilling this is and how South Korea is starting to sound like North Korea, is that during the Yoon government, he loved what we were doing, and they knew where we were doing all these drops. They knew all the islands that we were dropping in these materials. And because of that, the police knew, because the police would show up to make sure nobody stopped us. So the police knew that we were doing these things. Well, now, if you go to one of these sites where we're successfully getting in humanitarian aid into North Korea, you'll see plainclothes police who have been offered promotions if they arrest any of us. And you'll see signs to the citizens offering rewards if they turn in any of their fellow countrymen that are caught trying to deliver basically rice and radios and ramen noodles into North Korea. So this is the thing that's happening, and it's a tragic irony because the police knew exactly where all these drop sites were. This is significant because information is key to understanding what's going, for the people of North Korea, to understanding the outside world. And we were winning that battle, and that's why you see Kim Jong-un planting landmines, not just at the DMZ, but he's planted landmines at the China-North Korea border to kill his own people for trying to escape. They've got a shoot to kill order because it's the defectors that have escaped. They're telling us the reality and the truth about what's going on in North Korea. And it's the defectors that have been communicating back into North Korea the reality and the truth about South Korea's prosperity and the fact that America is actually cares very deeply for the North Korean people. We were winning that battle, but now the Lee government is doing everything that Kim Jong-un has asked. He's shut down the loudspeakers at the DMZ, which have been not just loudspeakers being turned off, but they've been torn down. 70% of North Koreans' ground forces and 50% of their air and naval forces were within 100 kilometers of the DMZ. So, of course, Kim Jong-un wanted all of that stopped, which Lee has done. He's doing everything that Kim Jong-un has asked him to do. And we know that Kim Jong-un is terrified of outside information. And that's why we see him executing teenage boys for listening to BTS and executing a teenage girl because she was distributing South Korean dramas. 2 women got executed that were repatriated on a bus from China. A couple of years ago, they were executed. So these are all methods that the dictatorship has enacted to try to stop the flow of information. So finally, my last point, because I know we're running out of time, the worst thing that has happened that President Lee has done is he has abandoned unification that is also called for under the South Korean Constitution. He's violating the South Korean Constitution in multiple ways, but one of them is this. The South Korean Constitution calls for the unification of Korea. It considers all the people in the Korean Peninsula citizens of the Republic of Korea. It calls for unification under the Republic of Korea's Constitution. But this is the policy of the Lee government. We strongly affirm our respect for the North system. The government of the Republic of Korea clearly reaffirms that it respects the North's current system, that it will not pursue any form of unification. So basically the Ministry of Unification in South Korea has abandoned unification and is showing its deep respect for the North Korean regime. Nobody respects the North Korean regime except for perhaps Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. So that's where we are, and I just wanted to put that from the perspective of what this means for the North Korean human rights movement. But we're never going to stop because the North Korean defectors have escaped. This is their homeland. They want it to be free. They know information is key, and they're the strongest American patriots that you'll ever find are the people who escaped out of North Korea. So with that, I will stop.
They're what I call foreign-born American patriots, Dr. Schultz, and it's so heartening, the work that you have been about all these years and the ongoing and absolutely indispensable effort to liberate the peninsula, and all the more, well, just absolutely infuriating that the communists are in the process of enslaving the entire peninsula instead. We pray that you will keep up the good work, and know you will. Our last and very, very patient contributor is our friend and colleague, Didi Laugesen, the president and CEO of a wonderful organization, which I'm proud to serve as a board member, Save the Persecuted Christians. Didi has been at the very forefront of the effort to call attention to the plight of Morse Tan, the fact that when I think she first sent up a flare, he had been prevented from leaving South Korea for 4 or 5 weeks. It's now 6 and counting, and he has actually now been, as we've heard, indicted as well, further extending the no travel ban and almost certainly giving rise to further difficulty for him and for the cause of freedom that he has served so well in South Korea, among other places around the world, in his previous incarnation as the ambassador at large for global criminal justice. Didi is going to talk to us a bit about such persecution, as well as the implications of all of this for not just the people of South Korea, but perhaps the people throughout the region and for us here at home as well. Didi, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for bearing with us as we've gone through these very, very important conversations to date.
Thank you, Frank. I think it's important that I hope you're recording me well, because my internet seems to be a little bit choppy. But I'm glad to be here with the Committee on the Present Danger China again for which I was the executive secretary for many years, as I also led Save the Persecuted Christians. And in that, Frank, we regularly engaged with Ambassador Tan, who was in Trump's first administration, the ambassador for global criminal justice. We met with him on issues of persecuted Christians, which is at 388 million heavily persecuted Christians in the world today, Frank. And those marginalized Christians, many very conservative in the countries in which they live, we are seeing that conservatives and Christians across the board are being marginalized, being made into second-class citizens, even in the West, where we're seeing the same kind of elements that Ambassador Tan spoke about at the top of the hour, active in the United States and in Europe. And Vice President J.D. Vance has been speaking into Europe about the liberal left really moving to policies that disregard human rights and really don't care for the citizens of the country, but elevate the minority above all else. And this truly is the globalism and the red-green axis that, Frank, you have been warning the world about since the 1990s, and you yourself have been persecuted and marginalized because of it. We saw in COVID that churches were shut down when abortion clinics were left open, when liquor stores were left open, and even pot shops were open, but you could not go to church. In South Korea, Pastor Sun Hyun-bo, who was detained by the South Korean government for much of this past year, he's out on house arrest right now, will be further prosecuted by the Lee Jae Myung regime. And we're seeing this across the board. Christians and conservatives in Korea are all under serious oppression right now, and their freedom is completely at risk. My biggest concern in coming upon Morse Tan's situation, when I visited Assistant Secretary for the DRL, Riley Barnes, DRL is Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. State Department, I just noted that he'd been to Korea, and in a comment I saw that somebody said Morse Tan is being held hostage. I went looking for information, and Frank, much to my surprise, there was no coverage on this. There are no public statements from the Trump administration about Ambassador Morse Tan's exit ban or his recent indictment, and he could be put into prison any day. He says this. The media, there's a complete blackout of media coverage of this. And we saw this during COVID. We saw it during the contested 2020 election. The Trusted News Initiative started by the BBC in 2019 has coalesced all of mainstream media into one voice. And because of this, the media blackout on Ambassador Tan is continuing to be solid. This is a serious issue that needs to be discussed among the American people, and yet the mainstream media, the fourth estate of the United States, is not doing their job. And Ambassador Tan is paying the price. And around the world, we're seeing Americans do not understand that the UK has fallen to Sharia, that India has fallen to a radical nationalist Hindu party, and that now in South Korea, one of our strongest allies in the region, we do not understand that they are being communized, as Ambassador Tan puts it. We are not being served by the media. And because of this, the American people do not understand the gravity of the global reach of communism today, Frank. All of our guests today, Captain James Fennell, Tara O, Suzanne Schulte, and Grant Newsham, have all spoken to these geopolitical issues. We are at war. We are in the midst of a world war. Russia is battling Ukraine. The U.S. is battling with Israel against Iran and all of the jihad forces of the Middle East. Africa is falling very fast, and so is Asia. We are now coming to understand. Frank, the American people deserve more from the Trump administration and from the media to understand the perils that are happening not only in South Korea, but here in the United States and across Western civilization. Xi Jinping's war against the world, his strategy of arson is working, and we need to mobilize immediately in America to stand against these forces. We're seeing the rise of communism in America with the DSA. It is not being countered, and we are in peril, Frank. Thank you.
Didi, amen to all of that. And it, of course, as you were saying earlier, the red-green dimensions of the threat here at home as well as abroad that is so alarming, really. I wanted to close, and in the interest of trying to keep this to basically our extended outer limit on these programs, I'll just take a few minutes and thank our wonderful panelists. But I wanted to leave you with this particular thought, sort of building off of what Didi just said. In the late 1940s, in the aftermath of World War II, period when Come Home America was very much top of mind for, well, the millions of men and women in uniform, as well as their loved ones and their political representatives. There was a movement afoot that is the impetus behind, ultimately, among other things, this Committee on the Present Danger of China. The movement was mounted by communists to seize control of the enormous landmass of China, to wrest it from a corrupt and rather despotic but pro-Western government under Chiang Kai-shek, and to bring to power one of the most evil regimes in the history of the world. That would be the Chinese Communist Party. The response to this movement, the political response, as it became clear that we had abandoned the Chiang regime, its government, warts and all, in favor of enabling its overthrow by the CCP under Mao Zedong, and ushering in the, well, again, unimaginably horrific genocide that Communist Party inflicted upon its own people. All in, by some estimates, 100 million of them have been murdered by the Chinese Communist Party. And that doesn't even count 400 million that they boast of having murdered in the womb as part of their one-child population growth restriction policy. There's never been anything remotely like it in the history of the world. And the question occurred to a lot of Americans: who lost China? I think what we've heard today, and to use Colonel Grant Newsham's expression, is the slipping away of another government, in this case, a democratically elected government, a government that had been very pro-Western, very reliable as an ally, very committed to resisting communism, whether it was across the DMZ or whether it was across the East China Sea. That government was effectively toppled by a coup, ratified by a fraudulent election, and now playing out is the slipping away, yes, the destruction of the Republic of Korea. and the teeing up of a new order in North Asia that almost certainly will conduce to the further pursuit by our mortal enemies. Yes, the North Koreans, but also the Chinese communists, of an agenda that will be very dangerous indeed, both for the people immediately affected in that region, but also billions elsewhere around the world, including here in the United States. Inevitably, at some point, the question will be asked, who lost South Korea? And we say with the greatest of respect and with the prayerful hope that this information will penetrate what has been the seeming studied indifference of too many around President Trump about what's been developing since that fraudulent election in South Korea. He will engage, late as this hour it is, to avert truly an historic disaster on his watch. And I say, almost certainly to his discredit, if he does not act. So with that, let me conclude by saying, as Didi did to each of our remarkable contributors to this program, it's really been one of the most important, I think, of all of the 230 or so that I think we've done to date. Morse Tan, we pray for your freedom, and we thank you for your courage, even there, in the midst of...
I think building kindness in children from a very young age is foundational to their growth, to building their character, to allow them to share with each other in a classroom and in a space that is safe, like in the Ganjin World platform. I'm a New York.
This enemy operation, you still are speaking truth to power. Captain James Fennell, you as well have been doing so admirably, both in uniform and out, as has Colonel Grant Newsham, as has Colonel Tara O, as has Suzanne Schulte and Didi Laugesen. We are deeply in your debt for taking the time to raise the alarm today in this forum, in this moment. And again, we simply ask God to spare our friends and allies, the people of South Korea, what the communists have in mind for them, and that we do our part to help assure they succeed. God bless you all. Please pass this very important program along to your circles of influence when it is produced by our friend and colleague, the great Oleg Atbashian. I also want to thank our friend Justin Johnson, producer of the Securing America program, for his incredible help in making this program possible as well. God bless you all, and God bless America.